Does Las Vegas really best symbolize America? What role did the invention of the clock play in creating the modern world? How does language shape the way we understand reality? These are just some of the questions we're going to be looking at in this video as we dive into Chapter 1 of Neil Postman's book, Amusing Ourselves to Death. Chapter 1 is titled The Medium is the Metaphor, and we are going to be looking deeply at the symbols and metaphors that shape the world we live in. Postman begins the first chapter of his book by referring to the importance of symbolism in American history. The Minuteman became the symbol of the Revolutionary War, of freedom, of the American spirit. The Statue of Liberty became a symbol of freedom, of openness to those seeking a better life, of the melting pot that New York City, and by extension the United States, was becoming. Postman titled the first chapter of his book, The Medium is the Metaphor, which is a play on his mentor Marshall McLuhan's famous aphorism, the medium is the message. For Postman, the medium of the Revolutionary War was summarized by the metaphor of the Minuteman. Postman's argument is that in his era, and to a great extent in ours, the medium of entertainment is summarized by the metaphor of Las Vegas. The values of entertainment are the values of Las Vegas, and these values have seeped out of Las Vegas into every aspect of human life. It's worth noting that it takes a while to discern the metaphors and how well or poorly they provide a key to understanding the events of history. As with all interpretive keys, they're only useful up to a certain extent. As Postman says, quote, I should be very surprised if the story I have to tell is anywhere near the whole truth. We are all, as Huxley says someplace, great abbreviators, meaning that none of us has the wit to know the whole truth, the time to tell it if we believed we did, or an audience so gullible as to accept it. Postman wrote his book in the early 1980s. Though the television had been around since the 1920s, though it only really became a cultural phenomenon during the 1950s. I mention this by way of pointing out that it took a while for cultural critics to discern the practical effects that television was having on culture. The question that recurs to me is, what would Postman have to say about the smartphone, artificial intelligence, cryptocurrencies, and all the emergent technologies that are present and on the horizon? Unfortunately for us, Postman passed in 2003. So it is up to us to carry on the torch of his work. Inspired by the ideas in Chapter 1, the question that I ask myself is, what are the mediums and what are the metaphors in our own time? I've come up with my own ideas, but I would be glad to hear what you come up with, and what are some of the great metaphors that would help future generations as well as ourselves understand the times that we're living in. Throughout American history, there have been many symbols that have caught the public attention. Among others, there was the cowboy, a symbol of the Wild West and of rugged individualism. There was the environmentalist, a symbol of the mountains and beaches of the West Coast in particular. The business tycoon, a symbol of New York and Chicago and of the Gilded Age. Another great American symbol could be summarized with the words made in the USA. These words became totemic in America during the late 20th century as more and more industry was offshored. Behind the symbol was the idea of American integrity and concern for craftsmanship. Postman writes, quote, American businessmen discovered, long before the rest of us, that the quality and usefulness of their goods are subordinate to the artifice of their display. That, in fact, half the principles of capitalism, as praised by Adam Smith or condemned by Karl Marx, are actually irrelevant. I mention made in the USA as it reflects a strain within American culture, and I'm sure that is present in other cultures, that places a premium on integrity. Postman's quote suggests that alongside the importance of integrity is another characteristically American tradition, making money as the highest of values. It's a simplification, but in many ways, the history of America has been a history of a battle of two main cultures. The culture of the country, of small-town America, which prioritizes community, the local, a love of and care for the land, and whose focus tends to be on the past and the present. And the culture of the city, which prioritizes the individual, efficiency, comfort, speed, and whose focus is on the future. It could be argued that post-war America has been a history of the victory of the culture of the city over the culture of the country. Halfway through the first chapter, Postman summarizes his book, quote, This book is an inquiry into and a lamentation about the most significant American cultural fact of the second half of the 20th century, the decline of the age of typography and the ascendancy of the age of television. End quote. He goes on to explain that this shift has irreversibly shifted the content of public discourse, for two such different media cannot express the same ideas. With the decline of the influence of text-based media, the content of public business, including education, politics, religion, and so on, must be translated into terms that are appropriate for television. Postman spends a good deal of the rest of the book looking at what being made appropriate for television entails. As I have written many times before, our work is to discern the invisible forces working upon us. Postman is correct in his insistence that the movement from the age of typography to the age of television is the most defining cultural shift in the 20th century. Once one understands this, it becomes easier to understand the other great cultural shifts that have taken and are taking place. I have remained steadfast to his, McLuhan's, teaching that the clearest way to see through a culture is to attend to its tools for conversation. Postman touches on another invisible factor that is noteworthy. One's language affects one's worldview. Quote, variations in the structures of languages will result in variations in what may be called worldview. How people think about time and space and about things and processes will be greatly influenced by the grammatical features of their language. One of the great blessings of my life was the opportunity to become fluent in the Greek language. On learning a second language, one becomes aware of both the strengths and the deficiencies in one's native tongue. After religious experience, language is the deepest and most ancient aspect of a culture and bears within itself an incredible depth and breadth. One's language acts as an invisible influence over the way we think, the kinds of conversations that we have, and so on. What is the great problem with metaphor? There are actually many problems with metaphor. As a tool for abbreviation, not all metaphors can be considered universal and can have the effect of confusing rather than clarifying things. But perhaps the greatest problem is that metaphor creates a certain distance between human thought and human experience. To this end, Postman quotes the German idealist philosopher Ernest Cassirer. Quote, physical reality seems to recede in proportion as man's symbolic activity advances. Instead of dealing with the things themselves, man is in a sense constantly conversing with himself. He has so enveloped himself in linguistic forms, in artistic images, in mythical symbols, or religious rites, that he cannot see or know anything except by the imposition of an artificial medium. My intuition is that Postman's attempt to interpret the Genesis admonition against graven images broadly could have been more usefully focused on the biblical writer's realization that there was a danger of creating an imbalance between the image and other forms of human expression. Representational images are metaphors and should not be worshipped. Images point to a reality beyond themselves. When, however, one remains within the metaphor, one runs the risk of living a disincarnate life. One of the great problems with the trajectory of modern life, influenced as it has been by the moving image, is that we are living increasingly disconnected from nature and from the natural world. This phenomenon is not new, however. Postman refers to the great cultural critic Lewis Mumford, who pointed out that the clock, quote, is a piece of power machinery whose product is seconds and minutes. In manufacturing such a product, the clock has the effect of disassociating time from human events, and this nourishes the belief in an independent world of mathematically measurable sequences. Moment to moment, it turns out, is not God's conception or nature's. It is man conversing with himself about and through a piece of machinery he created. So here is another invisible influence on our life, time as measured by a clock. I don't want to go too far down any given rabbit hole lest we lose track of the text at hand. That said, I would like to point out one thing that may help in framing our reading. When babies are born, they are largely unaffected by the invisible influences that we are now discussing. It's only over time, as one learns to speak and to interact with culture, that these invisible influences begin to control one's life. The goal with our current endeavor is to identify these influences and then to ask the basic question, do these influences improve or do they detract from my life? And if they do not improve my life, what can I do to mitigate their effects? Before moving on, I'd like to drill down a bit deeper into Mumford's thought, as filtered through Postman. In manufacturing such a product, the clock has the effect of disassociating time from human events, and thus nourishes the belief in an independent world of mathematically measurable sequences. In the process, we have learned irreverence toward the sun and the seasons, for in a world made up of seconds and minutes, the authority of nature is superseded. And thus, though few would have imagined the connection, the inexorable ticking of the clock may have had more to do with the weakening of God's supremacy than all the treatises produced by the philosophers of the Enlightenment. That is to say, the clock introduced a new form of conversation between man and God, in which God appears to have been the loser. The clock was invented in the 14th century and was a powerful step in the direction in which we find ourselves today, a world that we usually conceive of as a machine, a world of mathematically measurable sequences. The monks who invented the clock did not realize the effect that their invention would have, and the modern world's mechanistic worldview certainly cannot be traced back solely to the invention of the clock. But the clock definitely represents an important milestone in the development of machine thinking. To be able to see one's utterances rather than only to hear them is no small matter, though our education, once again, has had little to say about this. Our history and our literature are replete with metaphors, some of which are helpful and some of which reflect the understanding of bygone eras. As our culture embraces new technologies, new relationships are developed between humans and the world around us, and we subconsciously create new metaphors, many of which eventually find their way into the public consciousness and into the dictionary. For example, if you asked someone at the end of the 20th century to explain what a meme was, most would have had no idea what you were talking about, even though the word as well as the idea of a meme had been around for a while. As new technologies are adopted, new ways of relating to the world develop. Quote, "What I mean to point out here is that the introduction into a culture of a technique such as writing or a clock is not merely an extension of man's power to bind time, but a transformation of his way of thinking, and of course of the content of his culture. Because we find ourselves in a reality where culture is constantly developing, and because the speed of this change increases dramatically daily, it can be difficult to discern. As with most things, however, this process is like a muscle that can be stretched and strengthened. Quote, thus it takes some digging to get at them, the new metaphors and their consequences. To grasp, for example, that a clock recreates time as an independent, mathematically precise sequence, that writing recreates the mind as a tablet on which experience is written, that the telegraph recreates news as a commodity. And yet, such digging becomes easier if we start from the assumption that in every tool we create, an idea is embedded that goes beyond the function of the thing itself. We could take this last line as our mantra. Every new tool has unintended consequences. If we were wise, we would be hyper-vigilant about the tools that we allow ourselves and our communities to adopt. As we strengthen this muscle, we will find ourselves becoming increasingly skeptical about reality as it is described to us by the modern world. When one understands how culture develops and the ideas that are hidden within and propagated by our tools, one becomes increasingly skeptical about modern man's ability to understand and navigate the world properly. In this endeavor, we stand in the ancient tradition of techno-skeptics, from Socrates and Plato to Thoreau and Postman, who question the wisdom of our tools. Quote, we do not see nature or intelligence or human motivation or ideology as it is, but only as our languages are. And our languages are our media. Our media are our metaphors. Our metaphors create the content of our culture. That's it for our initial look at the foreword and chapter 1. As I mentioned at the beginning of this installment, feel free to read ahead, but so as to allow others to catch up with us, there will be no new reading this week. Also, this will give us all an opportunity to discuss chapter 1 this coming week. So next week's installment, we'll look at chapter 2 of Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death. As I mentioned previously, please join the conversation on my Substack page, on X, or wherever you would like. I am on most major social platforms and will be cross-posting as well as checking comments and so on at those locations. As always, if you haven't already, please subscribe. Follow me on social platforms, download the How Did We Get Here reading list, and we'll see you soon, hopefully in the comment section. If you have questions, thoughts, would love to hear how you're enjoying reading Postman's book. Take care. I'll see you soon.